Hey everyone, and welcome back. Before we settle in, if you're enjoying the journey, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is genuinely your kind of thing. No pressure. And drop a comment. Let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the global crowd these talks pull in. All right, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that low, steady hum in the background. Let's ease into this. Tonight, we're talking about the Vikings, a people who didn't just live in winter, they coexisted with it in a long-term, often contentious relationship. To our modern sensibilities, their very existence in those latitudes seems like a historical oversight, a glitch in the matrix of human habitation. By all reasonable logic, and several unreasonable ones, Viking homes should have failed immediately, catastrophically. They built their lives in places where winter didn't arrive politely with a dusting of snow and cheerful holiday music. It showed up early, uninvited, and belligerent, stayed far too long, and behaved like a hostile squatter who refused to leave and kept turning the thermostat down just to see what would happen. Snow there didn't fall, it accumulated with a grim, purposeful intent. Darkness wasn't an atmospheric condition, it was a lifestyle choice imposed by an absent sun. The sun itself would appear briefly, like it was doing a cursory courtesy check, a celestial pop-in, before disappearing again for months without explanation. The wind came off the sea not with a bracing chill, but sharp enough to make a rational person reconsider the entire project of inventing civilization in the first place. This was not brisk, this was not refreshing, this was the kind of deep, penetrating cold that made mistakes permanent. And yet, against this backdrop of what can only be described as a frozen punishment simulator, Viking homes did not freeze solid. Not halfway through winter, not during the worst storms, not even when the world outside seemed actively personally malicious. Families lived indoors for months on end without turning into cautionary tales. Children survived, elders survived, meals were cooked, petty arguments happened, life continued, which is frankly suspicious. If you took a modern, centrally heated suburban home and plopped it into that environment, it would immediately collapse, both structurally and emotionally. Pipes would burst in protest. The heating system would simply give up and emit a sad, mechanical sigh. Someone would start frantically Googling, is it normal for walls to scream? Emergency alerts would light up phones like it's the end of days. The Vikings, meanwhile, sat inside their longships thinking, yes, this is deeply unpleasant, but it is acceptable. This wasn't because they were magically resistant to cold, some kind of frost troll hybrid. They hated it. Frostbite hurt them just as much as it hurts you or me. People still died if they were careless or unlucky. The critical difference, the fundamental chasm between their world and ours, was that Viking homes were not built on hope. They were not constructed with a sunny optimism that maybe winter would be mild this year. They were built on the core, unshakable assumption that winter was hostile, cruel, capricious, and absolutely not impressed by human positivity. They didn't design their houses and then react when things went wrong. They designed their houses assuming that everything would go wrong always. Cold air would perpetually try to invade, wind would search relentlessly for the smallest weakness, snow would pile up with aggressive intent, fire would be fickle and unreliable. Therefore, the entire architectural philosophy was one of denial. Viking homes were designed to deny winter access, not heroically, not with dramatic flair, but quietly, methodically, almost rudely. The goal was not comfort by our standards, it was not beauty. The goal was starkly simple, to remain alive indoors while the outside world comprehensively lost its mind. And that's the key idea, the central thesis for everything that follows. The Vikings didn't try to defeat winter. That was a fool's errand. They just made sure winter wasn't invited inside. Everything else, the shape of the walls, the use of turf, the management of fire and smoke, all of it follows from that single, brutally sensible decision. Winter, with all its fury, should have won. It just ran into better planning. Once the Vikings accepted that winter was not going to negotiate, that it was an immutable, brutal fact of existence, they made their first profoundly smart move. They stopped building houses that politely sat on top of the ground like optimistic suggestions. Instead, they dug in, literally. Many Viking longhouses were partially sunken into the earth. This wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a strategic one. They understood something fundamental. The ground is surprisingly good at one thing, not panicking. While the air temperatures above ground were busy having dramatic mood swings, the soil a few feet down stayed calm, stable, and emotionally mature. The Vikings may not have had the scientific vocabulary of thermal mass or geothermal inertia, but they absolutely understood the principle. If you hide behind the planet itself, winter suddenly loses most of its leverage. Digging down meant the house immediately benefited from the Earth's natural insulation. The soil acts as a giant heat sink, absorbing warmth during the less frigid periods and slowly releasing it when temperatures plummeted. Cold air could scream and rage all it wanted above ground, but down where the house nestled into the earth, temperatures changed slowly, reluctantly, and with visible annoyance. This wasn't magic. This was common sense, reinforced by several generations of trial, error, and observing which of their neighbors had turned into ice statues. Sunken floors also had a secondary, crucial benefit. They drastically reduced the surface area of the house exposed to the wind. Wind, for all its power, is essentially lazy. It looks for the easy path, the big, flat, proud surface to push against. A house sticking proudly above the ground is an easy win for the wind. A house crouched low, hugging the landscape like it knows a secret, is a much more difficult and frustrating target. Viking homes were shaped less like monuments to human achievement and more like survival bunkers that had long since given up on impressing anyone. And there was another advantage the Vikings absolutely noticed: sheer stability. A house built partly into the ground stayed put. It didn't wobble ominously in howling storms. It didn't creak and groan dramatically like it was about to collapse for narrative tension. It just sat there, unimpressed by the weather, quietly and reliably doing its one job, providing shelter. Of course, digging into the earth wasn't exactly fun. It meant back-breaking labor. It meant mud, cold hands, wet boots, and slow, difficult progress. But the Vikings weren't trying to make the construction process enjoyable. They were trying to make winter survivable. Comfort during building was entirely optional. Comfort during living was non-negotiable. They even considered drainage, building on slight slopes to direct melting snow and rainwater away from the interior. Because nothing ruins your day faster than discovering your warm, earthy refuge has suddenly become an indoor marsh. They understood the fundamental equation: cold plus water equals profound, shivering regret. By lowering the house into the ground, the Vikings effectively removed winter's two favorite weapons: wind exposure and dramatic temperature swings. The house became harder to attack, harder to chill, and infinitely harder to intimidate. So before we even talk about walls, roofs, fires, and smoke, understand this foundational principle. Viking homes didn't start their design by figuring out how to fight winter. They started by figuring out how to hide from it. And honestly, that single decision won them half the battle before a single wall was even raised. Once the Vikings had sensibly tucked their homes into the earth, like pragmatic people hiding from a drunken brawl, they moved on to the next glaring problem: the walls. Thin walls were not an option. In the Viking world, thin walls were not a sign of poor craftsmanship. They were an open invitation. And winter is exceptionally good at accepting invitations, always arriving early and drinking all the mead. So Viking walls were thick, not just sturdy, not just well-built, thick, the kind that made the wind hit them and pause for a moment, quietly deciding it had better, easier places to be. These walls were not simple barriers, they were layered constructions, each element with a specific job. It started with a base of stone for stability and drainage, then packed earth to absorb and slowly release heat, then timber frame to hold everything together, and finally turf piled on top, like nature's own version of a heavy weighted blanket. Nothing about this was accidental.
Each layer was a line of defense. Stone provided mass and permanence. Earth acted as a thermal battery. Timber gave structural integrity. And the turf? The turf sealed gaps and smothered drafts with a kind of vegetative ruthlessness. Cold air didn't just have to get through a wall, it had to fight its way through a geological and botanical obstacle course, and frankly, it usually didn't have the stamina. Unlike modern walls, which prioritize looking perfectly smooth and hiding electrical wires, Viking walls prioritized one thing: not killing the people inside. They were uneven, lumpy, often bulging in odd places, and unapologetically ugly. And that ugliness, it turns out, is an excellent defensive strategy against an Arctic wind.